this would be a rapid fire of all of the tips and tricks that I learned while wiring up my first motorcycle. It's a list of 15 things that I want to talk about that will help you to make a better looking and better working wiring harness. So let's jump right in. Wiring can be quite overwhelming if you have never done this before. At least for me it was. I started with zero knowledge, and I would say the main thing that has helped me to gain a basic understanding of everything and be more confident when it actually came to wiring was to draw up my own wiring diagram from scratch. Not copy someone else's, but actually take all the different components and start to draw in my own connections. That whole process took me about 2 weeks and it created a lot of headaches because I had zero knowledge in the beginning, but it showed me all of the questions that I needed to answer. And that was where I started to really understand how things work together and what I needed to know in order to build a well-working wiring harness. So if you've never done this before, but you want to also wire up your bike, I made 2 videos specifically about the process, how you can draw your own wiring diagram from scratch. I'm going to link both of them down below. It definitely makes sense to invest the time in drawing up your own wiring diagram because it will make the rest of the wiring process so much more enjoyable. The only thing is that if you do this for the first time, it can be hard to really trust your wiring diagram because it's all still theoretical. Like, I never wired up anything before. So I knew, okay, theoretically this connection works, but does it really? So what helped me to overcome this stage of overwhelm was to do a bench test. What that means in short is you take some of your components and try to rig them up in a temporary setup on your workbench. You can start very simple with just a button and a light, for example, and then you add more and more things to really understand how everything goes together. And that helped me so much to be much more confident in my wiring diagram and actually know, okay, this is how this goes together. And I even had to tweak a few things. So it's a nice exercise before you start wiring up your bike. After you developed your own wiring diagram and you did the bench test, you will have a good basic understanding of how everything goes together. And now it's time to go to your bike, see which terminals there are so you can decide which wires you need, which supplies you have to get, which plugs you want to use, and also which tools you need to actually make your wiring harness. And at this point, it's very important that you choose the right wire and plug sizes so you don't accidentally set your bike on fire. If you want to know how that works, check out the video down below that I made specifically about those calculations. And if you want to get an overview of all of the things that I use to wire up the BMW, including all of the supplies, plugs, wires, and tools, then I'm also going to link you the video down below where I went through each of the components individually, because in the beginning, it took a lot of research to find all of the high quality components that will give you a nice looking wiring harness. And once you have all of the components, then it's time to familiarize yourself with everything. I actually went through each of the individual terminals and made at least one crimp to see if I have the right pliers, which opening of the crimp pliers I need to use, and if it's actually really on there or if I have to change something. And then I would also say, do at least one test plug for like the different types of plugs that you want to use. I went with the Deutsch pin connectors and the Mizu P25 plugs for the BMW. And it was a good practice to see how I can put them together, but also how to deepin them. And here I would say it definitely makes sense to invest in the proper deepinning tool, because even though they're often quite pricey for what you get, they're most often the only way of properly deepinning a plug without actually destroying it. What I also did in preparation for the actual wiring was to measure for each of the plugs how far the wires stick into the housing. That way, when you wire up a plug on the bike, you can just mark the wire at the end of the housing, at how far you measured it would stick in there, and then you know exactly where to cut. That's especially handy if you use higher quality plugs that come with little brackets so you can mount them directly to the frame, which is super nice because then they don't dangle around all over the place, but you also want to cut the wires very precisely if you have the plug secured to one spot on the frame. And the last thing that I can think of right now that you might want to test is the sleeving of the wires. See which size of sleeve you need for how many wires, and also which heat shrink works best with your sleeves. I, for example, noticed that the heat shrink without the glue doesn't really secure the sleeve to the wire, so I switched to heat shrink with glue. But obviously it's good if you notice that in the preparation phase and not halfway through the wiring job. Another thing that is very important to do at this point is to experiment with the wire routing on your bike, because it's definitely different than you imagine it on the wiring diagram. Don't forget to put the tank on, put the seat on every now and then to see if everything still has enough room, if anything gets pinched, because the more parts you add, the less space you'll have. And you might imagine something on the wiring diagram that doesn't work on your bike. So you need to stay flexible and maybe change things down the line. I definitely had to change a lot of the plug placements and stuff like that once I added like the ignition parts and things like that. Before I was like, oh, there's a huge gap underneath the tank, but then suddenly it was all crowded. So plan as well as you can, but stay flexible at the same time. Once you went through all of these planning stages, you'll be more than ready to start wiring up your bike, even though it might not feel like that at this point. But I would say take your time and go part by part. So pick the part that is easiest to you and then just wire that up and only move on once it's actually done. The horn, for example, just needs 2 wires, so you can build your confidence up connection by connection. And that really helped me to focus on one part, and then once that is done, move on to the next. I actually started with all of the vape ignition and charging system parts, only because all of the connections were relatively clear and they had super long wires that were all over the place and made the whole temporary setup super messy. So I wanted to clean that up so I could then go on and accurately plan all of the rest of the wiring. And when it came to actually making the first connections for the ignition and charging system, I had to cut all of the wires that were too long, and it intimidated me a lot to cut wires that already had working plugs installed on them. But I would encourage you to do that anyways, as long as you can ensure that you get an equally good or better plug or connection afterwards, because it will give you a much cleaner looking wiring harness if you have precisely cut wires, and also if you can use just one type of plugs for all of the connections on your bike. So you don't have a ring terminal here, you don't have spade terminals there, and then maybe a Deutsch pin connector there and a like cheap water seal connector there. If you can manage to just use one system of plugs and have precisely cut wires, that will upgrade your wiring harness to the next level. And if you're still looking for high quality plugs that you can use for your wiring harness, then I would say the Deutsch pin connectors are probably one of the best options out there. They're super easy to use, very high quality and water resistant. And if you get the kits from JReady, where I got them from, then you also get the high quality crimp pliers for a relatively reasonable price. I'm going to link you the 2 kits down below that I use so you can check them out. But yeah, we were speaking about cutting wires, and here I would say always cut a little bit too long, always leave some slack, because you never know if you maybe need to change the routing a little bit, or if a crimp connector maybe doesn't really work and you need to cut a little bit of the wire and do it again. So if you leave some slack, you'll make your life a lot easier. But I also noticed that you can always extend the wire or even replace the whole wire. So there's nothing really to lose, but it obviously makes it easier if it works the first try. What will also make your life easier, especially down the line, is if you already think about serviceability. That means that you already think about how you can take each of the individual parts off your bike without needing to rip the whole wiring harness off your bike, or worse, cut wires just to exchange an indicator, for example. So definitely think about that when you construct your wiring harness. And what will also save you a lot of headache down the line is if you can already make sure that you have good frame grounds and good connections in general. So for that, I would highly advise that you get a multimeter. And again, don't be intimidated by the tool or device. I definitely was, because it has like a billion settings, but I only use 2. I only use the continuity setting, which once I understood it became my absolutely best friend, and the one to read the charge of the battery. But the continuity setting is the one that I use all the time. So let me quickly show you how that works. We use the multimeter and set it to the continuity setting right here. You have to make sure that the red one is in the right terminal, because there are 2. So just make sure you plug it into the terminal with the same symbol. So if you have a connection, let's say from the engine here to there, it beeps. But sometimes you don't know, because for example, here's a terminal that I could use for this ground connection. So I want to quickly check if that is actually a feasible ground. I'm going to touch there, and then down here where the main ground lead connects. And that tells me that this is a ground that I can use. Knowing that will help you to build a more reliable wiring harness, because you can always check for a good frame ground, and you can also check for good connections or find faults. And what will also help you to make your wiring harness more reliable is if you always do a pull test after you crimped a terminal on a wire. That is so important. I had a few terminals actually come loose when I pulled properly, and you don't want that to happen once you're done with a bike and it holds maybe for a few hundred kilometers, and then at some point something comes loose. So you always want to give it a good pull and see if it actually stays on there. If you use the Deutsch pin connectors, for example, it's super easy to get a very solid connection, because you can adjust the pliers to the crimp terminal that you use and also the wire size. So you always know that you have a good connection, but still do the pull test. But what I noticed with the more generic ring terminals and the very generic like crimp pliers is that sometimes I actually had to experiment with the openings and not use the one that is dedicated for the wire size, but sometimes one that is a little bit smaller to get a proper crimp connection that actually holds. And speaking of crimp connections, here it's also important that you measure all of your crimp terminals, because the front part is supposed to crimp onto the bare wire and the back part is supposed to crimp on the insulation. So you definitely need to measure each of the crimp terminals individually to know how far you have to strip the insulation to get a proper crimp. And once you've measured all of the different crimp terminals that you want to use, you can make a list and say like ring terminals M5, for example, strip 4 millimeters. Deutschpin connector for DT series, crimp 7 millimeters, and so on. And then you get kind of like a standard operating procedure. And I actually extended that also to the heat shrink. And that will give your whole wiring a much more professional look, because I always took the same length of heat shrink for each of the individual applications. I crimped on a ring terminal, I used 15 millimeters of heat shrink. Let's say I sleeved 2 small wires with the smallest sleeve that I have. I use 20 millimeters on each side to secure that. For the bigger sleeves, I use 30 millimeters and so on. So I developed the whole like standard operating procedure for all of my supplies. You have to go through your own supplies and just note what works for your setup. But once you have that, that will give your wiring harness such a professional look. Another thing that will make your wiring harness so much more professional is always use heat shrink. Never use tape. And if you get a high quality sleeve, TechFlex has a few very, very good options, then that will elevate your wiring harness to even the next level. I would say to just go with one color, preferably black. I think that is the sleekest, but TechFlex has a few different colors. So if you want to go crazy, just go for it. Now with all of those things, your wiring harness will already look super, super clean. But if you want to take it one step further, you can think about fabricating little brackets for your wire management. On the BMW, for example, I made 2 little tunnels that sit inside the rear fender, and they already have integrated slots for the zip ties, so I can secure them there. But on the next build, I would like to push that even further and experiment with a little few things that I have in mind. I feel like here you can get very creative and hide all of the zip ties. But if you don't want to fabricate your own, then Prison Supply actually has a few very good options. I'm going to link their shop down below. And if you want to see all of those tips in practice now, then check out this video right here where I wired up the M unit and all of the parts of the BMW. I think you'll enjoy it. If you have any questions or any tips that helped you to wire up your bike, leave them down below in the comments. And as always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.